The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail as Tom Wheeler urged his weary horse forward. The year was 1887, and the frontier was still a dangerous place where death could come from rattlesnake bites, Apache raids, or simply the unforgiving desert itself. Tom knew he was dying. The persistent cough that had plagued him for months now brought up blood with increasing frequency, and his once strong frame had withered to little more than skin and bones. Tom had been a cattle driver for most of his adult life, moving herds across the vast expanse of the American West. He had seen men die from consumption before, and he recognized the signs in himself. The doctors in Tucson had confirmed what he already knew. His lungs were failing, and he had perhaps weeks, maybe days, left to live. But Tom wasn't ready to die in his stuffy hospital room. He wanted to see the open sky one last time, to feel the wind on his face as he had for so many years on the trail. His saddlebags contained his most precious possession, a small leather pouch filled with morphine tablets. The doctor had given them to him for the pain, warning him to use them sparingly as they were expensive and hard to come by on the frontier. Tom had been rationing them carefully, taking only half a tablet when the pain became unbearable. He knew these pills were the difference between dying and agony, and finding some measure of peace in his final days. As his horse picked its way carefully along the rocky trail through canyon to Shea, Tom's vision began to blur. The fever was getting worse, and he could feel his strength ebbing away like water through a cracked vessel. He had hoped to make it to the trading post at Chinle, where he could send word to his sister back in Missouri, but now he wasn't sure he would survive the journey. The magnificent red sandstone walls of the canyon rose around him like the walls of a cathedral, their ancient surfaces carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes. Tom had always found peace in places like this, far from the noise and bustle of civilization. If he was going to die, at least it would be in a place of beauty. His horse suddenly stopped and refused to go forward, its ears pricked forward in alertness. Tom raised his head with effort and saw what had spooked the animal. Ahead on the trail, a figure lay motionless in the dust. As Tom's eyes focused, he could see it was a young Native American woman. Her dark hair spread around her like a fan, her breathing shallow and labored. Tom dismounted slowly, his legs shaking with weakness. As he approached the woman, he could see she was burning with fever, her skin hot to the touch. Her lips were cracked and dry, and she mumbled incoherently in what Tom recognized as Navajo. He had learned enough of the language during his years on the frontier to understand she was calling for water. The woman appeared to be in her 20s, wearing traditional Navajo clothing that was now dusty and torn. Tom could see no obvious injuries, but her condition suggested she had been wandering in the desert for days without water or food. Her fever was so high that Tom knew she would die without immediate help. Tom looked around the desolate canyon walls, knowing he was probably dozens of miles from the nearest settlement. His own water supply was nearly exhausted, and he barely had the strength to continue his own journey. The logical thing to do would be to give her what little water he had left and continue on his way, hoping she would recover enough to find help. But as Tom looked down at the dying woman, he saw something that stirred his conscience. Around her neck hung a small silver cross, and he realized she must have had contact with missionaries. Perhaps she even shared his Christian faith. The thought that she might die alone in this desolate place, just as he was preparing to do, filled him with an unexpected resolve. Tom knew his morphine tablets could help reduce her fever and ease her suffering, just as they had been helping him. The medicine was precious beyond measure on the frontier, worth more than gold to someone in his condition. But looking at the young woman's face, peaceful in unconsciousness despite her obvious suffering, Tom made a decision that would echo through the years long after his death. He carefully opened his leather pouch and examined the remaining tablets. He had been saving them for his own final hours, knowing the pain would become unbearable as his lungs filled with fluid. But this woman was young, and unlike him, she might have a chance to live if she could just get through the fever. Tom lifted the woman's head gently and managed to get her to swallow one of the precious tablets with a few drops of his remaining water. He then tore strips from his own shirt to create a makeshift shade over her, using his rifle and some nearby rocks to hold the fabric in place. The sun was at its peak now, and without protection, the heat would kill her as surely as the fever. As Tom worked, his own condition worsened. The effort of caring for the woman had drained what little strength he had left, and he could feel his legs giving out beneath him. He managed to collapse into the small patch of shade he had created, lying beside the woman as they both struggled against their respective battles with death. Hours passed in a haze of heat and delirium. Tom drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of the woman beside him, sometimes lost in fevered dreams of his childhood farm in Missouri. The morphine was doing its work on the woman. Her fever began to break, and her breathing became more regular. But for Tom, who had given away his medicine, the pain in his chest grew steadily worse. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Tom heard the sound that would change everything. Distant voices echoed off the canyon walls, speaking in Navajo. The woman beside him stirred and weakly called out in response. Tom realized that someone was looking for her, and his heart filled with relief that she might yet be saved. The voices grew closer, and soon Tom could see figures moving along the canyon floor below them. A search party had been organized, and they had been following the woman's trail. Tom used the last of his strength to wave his hat in the air, attracting their attention to the small alcove where he had made shelter. The rescue party climbed quickly up the rocky slope, led by an older Navajo man whose weathered face spoke of years of wisdom and experience. Behind him came several younger men and women, their faces filled with relief at finding their missing tribe member alive. As they reached the makeshift shelter, Tom could see the surprise in their eyes at finding a white cowboy caring for one of their own. The older man, who Tom would later learn was the woman's grandfather and a respected medicine man of the tribe, knelt beside his granddaughter and quickly assessed her condition. He spoke briefly with the others in Navajo, then turned his attention to Tom. Despite the language barrier, the gratitude in the old man's eyes was unmistakable. Tom tried to explain what had happened, using the few Navajo words he knew and gestures to communicate. He showed them the empty space in his medicine pouch where the tablet had been, making it clear that he had given his own medicine to save the young woman. The medicine man's eyes widened with understanding, and he looked at Tom with something that went beyond mere gratitude. As the tribe members carefully lifted the young woman and prepared to transport her back to their settlement, Tom felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. He had spent his life driving cattle and thinking mainly of his own survival, but in his final hours, he had been able to do something truly meaningful. He had saved a life, and that knowledge eased the fear he had been carrying about his own approaching death. The medicine man said something to the other tribe members, and they began to construct a travois to carry Tom as well. Despite his protests that he was too far gone to be helped, they insisted on bringing him with them. Tom was too weak to resist, and as they carefully placed him on the stretcher, he closed his eyes and surrendered to whatever fate awaited him. As the small procession made its way through the darkening canyon, Tom reflected on the strange turn his final journey had taken. He had set out alone, expecting to die alone, but instead found himself in the care of people he had been taught to fear and distrust. The irony was not lost on him that the very people many of his fellow cowboys considered enemies were now risking their own safety to help him. The Navajo settlement appeared like a mirage in the moonlight as the rescue party crested the final hill. Tom's consciousness had been fading in and out during the journey, but he was aware enough to see the cluster of traditional hogans arranged in a circle around a central fire pit. Dogs barked in the distance as the group approached, and Tom could see figures emerging from the dwellings to investigate the commotion. The young woman, whose name Tom learned was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom in Navajo, had regained consciousness during the journey. She was weak, but coherent enough to explain to her family what the strange white man had done for her. Word spread quickly through the settlement, and by the time the travelers reached the central gathering area, most of the tribe had assembled to witness their arrival. Tom was carried into the largest hogan, which belonged to Ayana's grandfather, Hasty and Begay. The structure was unlike any building Tom had ever been in, circular and earth-covered, with a door facing east to welcome the morning sun. The interior was surprisingly spacious and comfortable, with woven rugs covering the floor and traditional furnishings arranged around the walls. Hasty and Begay was indeed a respected medicine man, and his knowledge of healing was renowned throughout the region. As his family settled Tom on a comfortable bed of blankets and furs, the old man began his examination. He had learned some English from traders over the years, and he spoke quietly to Tom as he worked. "You've gave medicine to granddaughter," Hasty and Begay said, his weathered hands gentle as he felt Tom's fevered forehead. "Why you do this? You not know us. Many white men, they fear us, hate us." Tom managed a weak smile. "She needed it more than I did," he replied simply. "Ain't no point in medicine if you can't use it to help someone." The medicine man's eyes studied Tom's face intently, as if looking for some sign of deception or ulterior motive. Finding none, he nodded slowly and began gathering various herbs and powders from pouches and containers arranged around the hogan. Tom had heard stories of Navajo medicine, often dismissed by white settlers as superstition, but he was too weak to protest even if he had wanted to. As Hasty and Begay worked, other members of the tribe came to visit. Ayana herself, though still weak, insisted on sitting beside Tom to express her gratitude. Through her grandfather's translation, she told Tom that she had been gathering medicinal plants in a distant part of the canyon when she had been caught in a sudden sandstorm. Disoriented and lost, she had wandered for 3 days without food or water before collapsing on the trail where Tom found her. "Grandfather says the spirits guided you to me," Ayana said through the translator. "He says this was not chance meeting." Tom wasn't sure what to make of such talk, but he could see the sincerity in the young woman's eyes. In his own faith tradition, he might have said it was God's providence, and perhaps that wasn't so different from what she was describing. Over the following days, something remarkable began to happen. The medicine man's treatments, combined with the constant care of the tribal members, began to have an effect on Tom's condition. The herbal teas reduced his fever, and poultices applied to his chest seemed to ease the terrible tightness in his lungs. For the first time in months, Tom began to hope that he might not be dying after all. But it wasn't just the medicine that was healing him. The kindness and acceptance he experienced from the tribe touched something deep in his spirit. These people owed him nothing, yet they cared for him as if he were family. Children brought him small gifts, interesting rocks, feathers, or drawings scratched in the dirt. The women ensured he always had food and water, and the men included him in their evening conversations around the fire, patiently helping him learn more of their language. Tom learned that the tribe was part of a larger Navajo community that had been struggling to maintain their traditional way of life in the face of increasing pressure from the U.S. government. Many of their people had been forced onto reservations, and those who remained free lived in constant fear of military action. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, the tribe had developed a strong sense of solidarity and mutual support. Hasty and Begay spent many hours with Tom, sharing stories of Navajo history and tradition. The old man was curious about Tom's background and listened with interest as Tom described his life as a cattle driver. Through these conversations, both men began to see past the cultural barriers that had separated their peoples for so long. "Your medicine, it saved Ayana's life," Hasty and Begay said one evening as they sat together outside the hogan, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. But more than medicine, it was spirit of giving that saved her. That spirit, it healed more than body. It healed heart. It healed fear between peoples. Tom was beginning to understand what the medicine man meant. His simple act of sharing his medicine had opened a door between two worlds that had been closed for generations. The tribal members who had initially viewed him with suspicion now sought out his company, eager to learn about life beyond their canyon home. As Tom's health improved, he began to contribute to the daily life of the settlement. His skills as a horseman were valuable to the tribe, and he helped train their young men in techniques he had learned during his years on the cattle drives. In return, they taught him their methods of tracking and desert survival, knowledge that would have been invaluable during his years on the frontier. But perhaps the most significant development was the friendship that grew between Tom and Ayanna. As the young woman recovered her strength, she became his unofficial teacher in Navajo language and customs. She was intelligent and curious, asking many questions about the world beyond the canyon. Tom found himself sharing stories of the cities he had visited, the different peoples he had encountered, and the changes he had seen sweeping across the West. Ayanna had been educated by missionaries and could read and write in both Navajo and English. She served as a bridge between Tom and the other tribal members, translating not just words, but cultural concepts that were difficult for outsiders to understand. Through her, Tom began to appreciate the complexity and richness of Navajo society, which was far more sophisticated than most white settlers realized. As weeks passed, Tom faced a decision that would have seemed impossible when he first arrived at the settlement. His health had improved dramatically, and while he would never be the strong young man he had once been, he was no longer dying. The question now was what to do with this unexpected gift of continued life. He could return to the world he had known, perhaps settling in one of the growing frontier towns where his experience and knowledge would be valued. Or he could remain with the tribe that had saved his life, contributing his skills to their ongoing struggle for survival. The choice was complicated by his growing affection for Ayanna and his respect for her grandfather's wisdom. The decision became even more complex when a group of white traders arrived at the settlement. They had come to negotiate for Navajo blankets and jewelry, but their presence reminded Tom of the vast cultural divide that still separated the two worlds. The traders were suspicious of finding a white man living among the savages, as they put it, and they warned Tom that he was risking his reputation and safety by associating with hostile Indians. Tom found their attitudes deeply offensive after his experiences with the tribe, but their visit forced him to confront the reality of the situation. If he chose to remain with the Navajo, he would be cutting himself off from his own people permanently. There would be no going back, no possibility of maintaining connections to both worlds. The traders also brought disturbing news from the outside world. Government pressure on the remaining free Navajo tribes was increasing, and there were rumors of military action being planned to force them onto reservations. The peaceful existence Tom had found in the canyon might not last much longer. As the traders prepared to leave, their leader made Tom an offer to join them as a guide and interpreter. His knowledge of the region and his newfound familiarity with Navajo customs would make him valuable in future trading expeditions. It was an opportunity to return to a life more familiar to him, while still maintaining some connection to the people who had saved him. Tom asked for time to consider the offer, but he could see the concern in Hasty and Begay's eyes. The old medicine man had grown fond of him, and losing Tom would be a blow to the tribe. More importantly, Tom's departure would be seen by some as evidence that the trust they had placed in him had been misplaced. The autumn winds brought more than just cooler weather to the canyon settlement. They carried whispers of approaching danger that made even the normally calm Hasty and Begay pace restlessly around the central fire each evening. Tom had learned to read the subtle signs of concern among the tribal members, and he could sense the growing tension that seemed to thicken the air like an approaching thunderstorm. The news came through a network of communication that Tom was only beginning to understand. Navajo runners moved between scattered settlements, carrying messages faster and more efficiently than any telegraph system. The message they brought was grim. A large military force was assembling at Fort Defiance, and their orders were to round up all remaining free Navajo and transport them to the internment camp at Bosque Redondo. Tom had heard of Bosque Redondo during his cattle driving days. It was a barren piece of land in eastern New Mexico where thousands of Navajo had been imprisoned after the military campaigns of the 1860s. Those who had survived the experience called it a place of death and despair, where traditional ways of life were forbidden and families were torn apart. The thought that his newfound friends might face such a fate filled Tom with a rage he hadn't felt since his youth. Ayanna found him sitting alone outside the settlement one morning, staring out at the canyon walls that had become as familiar to him as the faces of his adopted family. She settled beside him on the rocky outcrop, her presence both comforting and troubling. "The trader's offer still stands," she said quietly in English, her accent giving the words a musical quality that Tom had grown to love. "Grandfather would understand if you chose to leave. This is not your fight." Tom turned to look at her, seeing the strength and sadness in her dark eyes. In the months since his arrival, he had watched her bloom from a near-death victim into a confident young woman who served as a bridge between the old ways and the new challenges facing her people. The thought of leaving her to face the approaching crisis alone was unbearable. "Isn't it?" he replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "These people saved my life, Ayanna. More than that, they gave me a purpose I never knew I was missing. If that doesn't make it my fight, then I don't know what would." Over the following days, the settlement transformed itself from a peaceful community into a fortress of preparation. Hidden weapons were retrieved from secret caches, and the younger men began intensive training in guerrilla warfare tactics. Tom found himself in an unexpected position as a military advisor, his knowledge of cavalry tactics and army procedures suddenly invaluable to the tribe's defense planning. Hasty and Begay called for a council meeting that included not just the settlement's residents, but representatives from other Navajo groups scattered throughout the canyon system. Tom was honored to be included in these deliberations, though he understood that his presence was controversial among some of the more traditional tribal members. The debate that ensued was intense and emotional. Some argued for immediate flight deeper into the canyon system, hoping to hide in places so remote that the army would never find them. Others advocated for surrender, believing that resistance would only bring greater suffering to their people. A few of the younger warriors spoke passionately about fighting, regardless of the odds against them. Hasty and Begay listened to all perspectives with the patience that had made him a respected leader, but Tom could see the weight of responsibility pressing down on the old man's shoulders. Whatever decision was made would affect not just the warriors, but the children, the elderly, and the women of the tribe. There were no good choices, only degrees of terrible consequence. When called upon to speak, Tom found himself in the difficult position of offering advice that might lead to the deaths of people he had come to love. He chose his words carefully, speaking through Ayanna's translation to ensure his meaning was understood. "I've seen what the army can do," he said, his voice carrying across the silent circle of faces lit by firelight. "They have discipline and weapons and numbers on their side. But they also have weaknesses. They don't know this land the way you do, and they don't understand your people. If you choose to fight, it can't be the kind of fight they're expecting." He went on to outline the basics of guerrilla warfare, drawing from stories he had heard from veterans of the Civil War and his own observations of Apache tactics during his cattle-driving days. The key was to avoid direct confrontation while using superior knowledge of the terrain to strike quickly and disappear. It was dangerous and would require sacrifices from everyone in the community, but it offered at least a chance of survival with dignity intact. The council deliberated through the night, with Tom eventually excusing himself to allow the tribal members to make their decision without outside influence. He walked to his favorite overlook above the settlement, where he had spent many evenings contemplating the strange turns his life had taken. The decision they reached tonight would determine not just the fate of the tribe, but his own future as well. Ayanna found him there as the sun began to rise, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson that had become as familiar to him as breathing. Her face told him the decision before she spoke. "We fight," she said simply, "but not just with weapons. Grandfather has a plan, and he wants to know if you will help us." The plan that Hasty and Begay outlined was both brilliant and dangerous. Rather than simply hiding or fighting, the tribe would use their knowledge of the canyon system to create a network of refuges connected by secret trails known only to them. They would appear to submit to the army's demands while actually evacuating their most vulnerable members to safety. Meanwhile, a small group of warriors would remain behind to conduct hit-and-run attacks designed to convince the military that the entire tribe had fled the region. Tom's role in this plan was crucial, but perilous. His appearance and knowledge of army procedures would allow him to move freely between the military forces and the hidden Navajo camps, serving as both spy and coordinator. It was a position that would require him to deceive his own people while risking execution as a traitor if he were discovered. The personal cost of this decision was brought home to Tom when Ayanna pulled him aside after the planning session. With tears in her eyes, she explained that she would be among those evacuated to the deepest and most secure hiding places where no white man had ever set foot. If Tom chose to take on his dangerous mission, they might never see each other again. "There's another choice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could come with us to the hidden places. Grandfather says you have earned a right to know our deepest secrets. You would be safe there, and we could be together." The temptation was overwhelming. The thought of spending his remaining years in some hidden paradise with a woman he had come to love seemed like a gift beyond imagining. But Tom also knew that without his help, the plan to save the tribe might fail, condemning all of them to the living death of Bosque Redondo. As he struggled with this impossible choice, Tom remembered the moment when he had given his precious medicine to a dying stranger. That decision had seemed simple at the time, motivated by nothing more than basic human compassion. Now he faced a similar choice, but with far greater complexity and consequences. The arrival of army scouts in the canyon forced the issue. Time for preparation had run out, and the elaborate plan they had developed would have to be put into action immediately. Tom made his choice, knowing it might be the last decision he would ever make as a free man. He would play his part in the deception, using his knowledge and appearance to help save the people who had saved him. But first he had one final night with Ayanna, and they spent it not in words but in quiet companionship, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the ancient songs that drifted up from the settlement below. When morning came, Tom put on his old cowboy clothes for the first time in months, the familiar weight of his gun belt feeling strange after his time among the peaceful Navajo. Ayanna gave him a small medicine bundle that her grandfather had prepared, containing herbs and stones that she said would protect him on his dangerous journey. "Remember," she whispered as they said their farewells, "no matter what happens, you will always be part of our people now. The spirits have marked you as one of ours, and that bond cannot be broken by distance or time or even death." As Tom rode out of the canyon to begin his mission, he carried with him more than just Navajo secrets and military intelligence. He carried the trust and love of an entire community, and the knowledge that his actions in the coming days would determine whether that community survived to pass their traditions on to future generations. The military camp at the mouth of Canyon de Chelly was exactly what Tom had expected, a precise arrangement of white tents organized in neat rows, with sentries posted at regular intervals and horses picketed in perfect lines. The sight of it brought back memories of his brief service during the Civil War, when he had been too young to understand the true cost of military efficiency. Major Harrison Clark was a career officer who had spent most of his adult life fighting Indians across the frontier. He was neither cruel nor particularly sympathetic to his targets. He simply viewed the removal of free Navajo as another military objective to be accomplished with maximum efficiency and minimum loss of army personnel. When Tom rode into camp, claiming to be a former cavalry scout who had been tracking the hostiles, Clark accepted his credentials without question. "Wheeler, is it?" Clark said, looking up from a map spread across his field desk. "You say you've been following these particular Indians for how long?" "Better part of 3 months, sir," Tom replied, forcing himself to adopt the formal tone he remembered from his army days. "Been tracking them since they raided a supply train near Gallup. They're holed up deep in the canyon system, but I know their movements. It was a carefully constructed lie designed to explain Tom's knowledge of the tribe's locations while giving him credibility as a scout. Clark seemed satisfied with the explanation, especially when Tom demonstrated his familiarity with the canyon's geography and his ability to speak basic Navajo. Over the following days, Tom walked a dangerous tightrope between his two loyalties. During the day, he guided Army patrols through the outer reaches of the canyon, always managing to miss the tribe's actual locations by just enough to avoid suspicion. At night, he slipped away from the camp to meet with Navajo runners who brought him updates on the evacuation's progress and new intelligence about Army movements. The evacuation was proceeding more slowly than hoped. Moving elderly tribal members and young children through the treacherous canyon passages without leaving obvious signs for Army trackers was proving to be an enormous challenge. Several times, Tom had to misdirect patrols that came dangerously close to discovering refugee groups making their way to the hidden sanctuaries. The most difficult part of his deception was maintaining the cold, professional demeanor expected of an Army scout, while watching soldiers prepare for actions he knew would devastate his adopted people. During planning sessions, he listened to officers discuss the Navajo as if they were dangerous animals to be trapped and caged, and he had to bite his tongue to keep from defending people he had come to love and respect. Major Clark was particularly frustrated by the apparent ease with which the Indians seemed to vanish whenever his patrols approached their reported positions. "It's like they're ghosts," he complained to Tom during one of their evening briefings. "Every time we get close, they disappear into thin air." "They know this country better than we do, sir," Tom replied carefully. "But I think I've figured out their pattern. Give me a few more days, and I can lead you right to their main camp." It was a dangerous gambit designed to buy more time for the evacuation while maintaining his credibility with Clark. Tom had identified a location deep in the canyon system that the tribe had abandoned weeks earlier, but that would show enough signs of recent habitation to convince the Army they were on the right track. The deception worked better than Tom had dared to hope. When he led a large patrol to the abandoned camp, they found clear evidence of recent Navajo presence: old fire pits, discarded items, and tracks that Tom had helped to enhance during his reconnaissance visits. Clark was convinced they were closing in on their quarry and ordered an intensification of patrol activities throughout the region. But Tom's success created new problems. The increased military pressure made it nearly impossible for the remaining Navajo to continue their evacuation without being spotted. Several close calls convinced Hasty and Begay that they needed to accelerate their timeline, even if it meant taking greater risks. The message that reached Tom through the runner network was both urgent and heartbreaking. The evacuation was only half complete, but Army patrols were getting too close to the hidden routes. The tribe's leaders had decided to sacrifice the few for the many. The remaining warriors would stage a diversionary attack that would draw the Army's attention while the final groups of refugees made their escape. Tom realized with growing horror that he was being asked to help coordinate an attack against the very soldiers he had been living and working with for weeks. Some of these men had shared their rations with him, told him stories of their families back home, and treated him as a trusted comrade. Now he would have to betray that trust to save his Navajo family. The internal conflict that had been building in Tom finally reached a breaking point. As he sat in his tent on the night before the planned attack, cleaning his rifle and preparing his gear, he faced the full weight of what he had committed himself to do. There would be casualties on both sides, and some of the blood would be on his hands regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. His brooding was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Murphy, an Irish immigrant who had befriended Tom during his time with the patrol. Murphy was a career soldier, but also a man of deep faith who often questioned the morality of the wars he was ordered to fight. "Something's eating at you, Wheeler," Murphy observed, settling down on a supply crate outside Tom's tent. "You've been quiet as a church mouse these past few days." Tom struggled to find words that wouldn't betray his true situation. "Just thinking about what we're doing here, Sergeant. Chasing families through the desert to drag them off to some godforsaken reservation. Doesn't seem much like soldiering to me." Murphy was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars that shone with brilliant clarity in the clean desert air. I've had the same thoughts myself. But orders are orders, and we're not paid to question the wisdom of our betters. Still, it weighs on a man's conscience, it does. The conversation continued late into the night, with both men sharing their doubts about the justice of their mission. Tom found himself walking a careful line, expressing enough sympathy for the Navajo to gauge Murphy's true feelings while avoiding any statements that might later be seen as evidence of treason. What he discovered both surprised and encouraged him. Murphy and several other enlisted men had serious reservations about the forced removal policy, though their military discipline prevented them from acting on those feelings. Tom began to wonder if there might be a way to minimize the violence of the coming confrontation without completely abandoning either side. The plan that began to form in Tom's mind was desperate and probably doomed to failure, but it offered at least a chance of reducing the bloodshed that seemed inevitable. Instead of simply warning the Navajo about army movements, he would try to orchestrate a confrontation that would satisfy military objectives while allowing maximum opportunity for the warriors to escape after accomplishing their diversionary goals. It would require precise timing and extraordinary luck, but Tom had seen enough of both military operations and Navajo tactics to believe it might be possible. The key would be ensuring that the Army's pursuit was vigorous enough to draw them away from the evacuation routes, while being just ineffective enough to allow most of the warriors to survive the encounter. As dawn approached, and the camp began to stir with preparations for another day of patrol activities, Tom made his final preparations for what he knew might be the last day of his life. If his plan failed, he would likely be shot as a traitor by one side or the other. If it succeeded, he would have to live with the knowledge that he had manipulated good men on both sides for what he believed was a greater good. The irony was not lost on him that his journey toward this moment had begun with a simple act of sharing medicine with a dying stranger. That spontaneous gesture of compassion had led him down a path he could never have imagined, transforming him from a dying cowboy into a man willing to risk everything for the survival of people who had once been strangers to him. As he saddled his horse and checked his weapons one final time, Tom thought about Ayanna and wondered if she was safe in whatever hidden sanctuary the tribe had prepared for their most precious members. The memory of her face gave him the strength to face whatever the day might bring, knowing that his actions would help determine whether she lived to see her grandchildren playing in the ancient canyons of her ancestors. The confrontation came at dawn on a crisp October morning when the canyon walls caught the first light and threw it back in shades of gold and crimson. Tom had positioned himself on a rocky outcrop overlooking the narrow pass where he had arranged for the Navajo warriors to make their stand. Below him, Major Clark's column advanced with military precision, unaware that their scout was no longer the ally they believed him to be. The first shots echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, followed immediately by the sharp crack of return fire from Army carbines. Tom watched through his field glasses as the carefully orchestrated battle unfolded according to the plan he had helped design. The Navajo warriors attacked with just enough force to convince the soldiers they were facing the tribe's main war party, then began a fighting retreat deeper into the canyon system. Major Clark took the bait exactly as Tom had hoped. Believing he had finally cornered the elusive Indians, the Major ordered his entire force to pursue the retreating warriors, leaving the outer approaches to the canyon completely unguarded. It was precisely the opportunity the remaining refugee groups needed to complete their escape to the hidden sanctuaries. But even the best-laid plans could not account for every variable, and Tom watched in horror as Sergeant Murphy's squad became separated from the main column during the chaotic pursuit. The Irish sergeant and his men found themselves trapped in a box canyon with a group of young Navajo warriors who had been cut off from their planned retreat route. Tom made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Abandoning his observation post, he spurred his horse down the treacherous slope toward the trapped soldiers, shouting warnings about an ambush that existed only in his imagination. His intervention allowed Murphy's squad to escape the trap, but it also cost the lives of two young Navajo warriors who might have survived if Tom had not interfered. The remainder of the battle proceeded largely as planned. The Navajo warriors led their pursuers on a winding chase through increasingly difficult terrain before melting away into passages too narrow for horses. By evening, the frustrated army had captured nothing but empty campsites and a few elderly tribal members who had volunteered to be taken prisoner to add credibility to the deception. Major Clark was furious at what he saw as another failure, but Tom's detailed reports on Navajo escape routes and defensive positions satisfied the major that his scout had performed admirably under difficult circumstances. The official report would describe a successful action against hostile Indians that had eliminated their organized resistance in the region. 3 days later, Tom received word through the runner network that the evacuation had been completed successfully. Hasty and Begay and the other tribal leaders had managed to move over 200 people to hidden refuges so remote and well-concealed that they could remain there safely for years if necessary. The immediate crisis had passed, but Tom's role in the deception was far from over. For the next several weeks, Tom continued his dangerous double life, feeding false information to the army while helping to coordinate the tribe's transition to their new hidden existence. It was exhausting work that required constant vigilance and left him little time for rest or reflection. The weight of his deceptions and the memory of the young warriors who had died began to take a toll on his health and spirits. The end came suddenly and unexpectedly. During a routine patrol, Tom's horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and threw him hard against a rocky slope. The fall reopened old injuries to his chest and left him with a concussion that made it impossible for him to continue his scouting duties. Major Clark, satisfied that organized Indian resistance in the area had been eliminated, granted Tom an honorable discharge and a small pension in recognition of his service. As Tom recovered from his injuries in the Army hospital at Fort Defiance, he received a visit that would change the course of his remaining years. Hasty and Begay arrived at the fort disguised as a visiting medicine man, claiming to have herbs that might help the injured scout. The reunion between the two men was emotional, but necessarily brief and discreet. "The people are safe," the old man whispered in Navajo as he examined Tom's injuries. "Ayana sends her love and asks when you will come home to us." The question hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Tom's service with the army was over, and there was nothing to prevent him from disappearing into the hidden world his friends had created. But he also knew that his presence among them would always carry the risk of discovery, potentially endangering the very people he had fought to protect. Hasty and Begay seemed to understand his dilemma. "There is another way," he said quietly, "a way to serve both worlds without betraying either." The plan the medicine man outlined was both simple and revolutionary. Tom would establish himself as a trader and mediator, using his unique knowledge of both cultures to build bridges between the hidden Navajo communities and the outside world. He would help other Indians navigate the complex legal and social challenges of life under American rule, while secretly maintaining contact with the free tribes. It was dangerous work that would require him to walk a careful line between his two loyalties for the rest of his life. But it also offered the possibility of building something positive from the ashes of the conflict that had consumed so many lives. Tom accepted the role, and over the following years, he became a legendary figure in the Southwest. Known as Navajo Tom to the white community and Gray Fox to the Indians, he helped dozens of tribal groups negotiate fair treatment with government officials and protected sacred sites from desecration by miners and settlers. His trading post became a neutral ground where representatives of different cultures could meet safely, and his reputation for fairness and integrity made him a trusted mediator in disputes that might otherwise have led to violence. Few people knew the full extent of his activities, but those who did understand that his work prevented countless conflicts and saved many lives. The hidden Navajo communities thrived under this protection, maintaining their traditional ways of life while gradually adapting to the changing world around them. Children grew up speaking both Navajo and English, learning ancient ceremonies alongside practical skills that would help them survive in modern America. Tom's reunion with Ayanna came 2 years after the evacuation, when he was finally able to visit one of the hidden settlements without compromising its security. Their relationship had deepened during their separation, strengthened by the shared understanding of sacrifice and service that now defined both their lives. They were married in a traditional Navajo ceremony conducted by Hastian Begay in a sacred grove that had been used for such purposes for hundreds of years. Tom had learned enough of the language and customs to participate fully in the rituals, and the tribe's acceptance of him as Ayanna's husband marked his complete transition from outsider to family member. Their children would grow up bilingual and bicultural, serving as bridges between worlds in their own right. Tom taught them the skills he had learned during his cowboy days: horsemanship, marksmanship, and survival techniques, while Ayanna and her grandfather shared the deep wisdom of Navajo tradition. As Tom aged, he often reflected on the strange turns his life had taken since that day when he had chosen to share his medicine with a dying stranger. What had seemed like a simple act of compassion had led to a lifetime of service that affected countless lives across multiple generations. The secret of the hidden Navajo communities was maintained long after Tom's death, with his children and grandchildren continuing the work he had begun. The trading post he established became a lasting institution that facilitated peaceful coexistence between cultures that had once seemed irreconcilably opposed. Historians would later recognize Tom Wheeler as one of the most successful mediators in the history of the American Southwest, though they never fully understood the extent of his activities or the secret communities he helped to protect. The official records show only that a former cowboy had become a respected trader and advocate for Indian rights. The true story of his work was preserved in the oral traditions of the Navajo people, where it became part of the sacred history passed down from generation to generation. In these stories, Tom Wheeler was remembered not as the dying cowboy who had offered his medicine to a stranger, but as the man whose compassion had grown into a lifetime of service that helped ensure the survival of an entire people. The medicine he had shared that day in the canyon had indeed saved a life, not just Ayanna's, but the lives of all those who benefited from the network of protection and understanding that grew from his simple act of kindness. It was a legacy that continued long after his death, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the most profound consequences. When Tom Wheeler died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried both Navajo and Anglo heritage in their blood, his passing was mourned by people across the Southwest. But his greatest monument was not any building or institution. It was the thriving communities of free Navajo who continued to practice their ancient ways in hidden valleys that remained safe because of the choices made by a dying cowboy who had chosen compassion over self-preservation in his darkest hour.